All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our second Black History Month talk for the month of February. My name is Gina Wakai. I am a librarian here at Norquest, and I'm also the lead of the Black History Month working group. So, thank you all for coming out today. Today is going to be an excellent talk. I'm really excited for it, and I hope you are as well. So we have Junetta Jamerson, and I'll just give you her bio here. So she is a hereditary member of Alberta's early African American community. So if you're familiar with places like Amber Valley, that's her family. Those are her ancestors. She is an emancipationist, an anti-racism expert, a community builder, and an award-winning Black youth educator. And she's worked extensively on issues ranging from discrimination and inequity to women's uplifting and empowerment. Junetta is also one of the founding members of Black Women United YEG, which is an advocacy collective, and it's committed to the advancement and protection of Black women and girls. And like I said, I'm so excited to have her here today. Her talk is going to be absolutely excellent, so I hope you are looking forward to it. And without further ado, here is Junetta.
Well, thank you, Gina, for that introduction. Now, I'm going to be challenged to get through everything today. So we're going to have to get started right away. So as you have alluded to, I've worked for years on the preservation of my people's history, and really just took up the baton from work that my father, Laverne Carter, had done, and his mother, my grandmother, Velma Leffler Carter, had done. And she was actually the first cultural documentarian and one of our early educators in the African American settlement community. And there's all kind of different people running around, positioning themselves around Black history today. There was barely anyone 5 years ago, so that's a change. And it's important for the listener to understand what ideological framework they are bringing to they are applying to Black history. So I wish to start this off by going into a little bit of my ideological framework, because this is what's going to shape everything that comes next. So understanding that an ideology is a particular set of ideas or beliefs. And that's what informs my history, my Blackness, identity. And there's a few subsets of that I'd also want to share with you. Another one is womanism, which is a focus on feminism, focus on culture, the lived realities and concern of Black women. Another part of my ideological framework is anti-racism, as you mentioned, which is a form of action against racial hatred, bias, systemic racism, and the oppression of people of color. Another one is anti-oppression, which is the action against the use of power to disempower, to marginalize, silence, or subordinate one social group in order to further the privilege of the oppressor. In essence, it's for me to be up, you got to be down. Lesser known is Black liberation theology, perhaps made more popular by Martin Luther King. It's a contextualization of Christianity to empower Black people to stand against oppression. And Pan-Africanism, my people were Garveyites, and it's a belief that African descended people the world over have a common interest and should seek to unify. So let's pull up the first slide, please. And we're going to start out by just taking a very high level look at some of Alberta's Black history, but we're going to look at how some of these things just kept on repeating through the years, right? There's so much to history that there's no way I could even dig in deeply in the short time that we have. So I'm going to start out with the early Black presence in Alberta. So this is prior to 1870. It's mostly, but not exclusively, single men who married Indigenous women once they were in Canada. And it included fur traders like Glasgow Crawford, He was a cook and he was a middleman. He had his presence here in Alberta about from 1818 to 1821. And it was recorded that while he was working for the Hudson Bay Company in what is now Alberta and Saskatchewan, they weren't provinces then. It's on record that he was involved in conflicts stemming from racist abuse while working in the camp cookhouse. And he would push back. He would push back against some of the out of pocket things that were said and done to him, including even by some of the children who, even though he was older than them, felt that they did not have to show respect because he was Black. So this whole concept of respect for elders was lost on them, of course. And they even went further to accuse him of theft of provisions, which, quite frankly, I don't even know if that was true or not. It would be convenient way to put him in his place. However, he spoke English, French, Iroquois, and was a valuable translator. So even though there was these problems and Brother Crawford tried to stand up for himself, they kept him around because of his value as a translator. And then in about 1822, we have Stéphane Etienne Bonga. Now he's pictured here. He was also a trader, translator. He was part of the whole Mackenzie and Rowan exploration of the Bow River, and he ended up settling back in Minnesota. He didn't stay. We also have some of the early first Black presence in 1799. Joseph Lewis also went by Levi Johnston. He was a fur trader in West Rupert's Land, which much later became the province of Saskatchewan and Alberta, and was probably the first Black person to settle in, then what we now know as Alberta. So that's going back a long time, 1799, to have perhaps a permanent Black presence in Alberta. Next one, please. And then here we have somebody that's a little more familiar. So after 1870, we have cowboys. So like the famous John Ware, he came here in 1882, and he was a formerly enslaved African from South Carolina. He moved west into Texas after emancipation. And he was a cattleman, he was a horseman, and he was involved in these cattle drives that took him up out of Texas, even just continuing going up until they were in Montana, up into then Alberta. And in fact, he brought the first cattle into the region as the buffalo were being decimated. Okay, because before the buffalo, of course, were the main food source and kind of bovine presence or whatever, and then they were replaced by the cattle that John Ware brought. Now, his wife, pictured there, her name is Mildred. She was from an Eastern Canadian family, the Lewises, and she was one of several Black families who had come west, and they continued to do so over the next decade. So we also had some of those folks from out east. They were mostly Underground Railroad descended families. So they had been in Canada going back probably at least 50 years earlier. And they started to move west, a few of them. Some of them even married into relations of mine. Mr. Ware was an incredible horseman, and he had skills and knowledge that few others had. And according to historian Cheryl Fogo, he introduced irrigation into southern Alberta. He owned over 1,000 heads of cattle. In addition to the horses and other animals, the man had 2 ranches, all while being a husband and a father to 6 children. And one of them, Nettie, she's actually the little baby that was pictured there. She was a dear friend of my grandmother, Velma Carter. A popular narrative is that John Ware was so kind and gentle and well-liked and a symbol of Alberta's racial tolerance. But according to Cheryl, he was also refused service all the time and had the Calgary police called on him when he just tried to patronize an establishment. So it seems like the Karens and the Kevins have been at it for a mighty long time. They stayed calling the cops on John Ware. And because they loved him so much, they named some things for him when he died in 1905. One of the first being a mountain called N-word John Ridge. So N-bomb John Ridge. Okay? That's what they did in honor of him. And that name stuck until they finally changed it in 1970 to John Ware Ridge. It took 65 years for this province to have what was an official name. It was on official maps, geological signs, and things like that, to call him by his God-given name. So I guess it kind of got to the point where they decided, this is like a not a good look 65 years later. So, we'll at least stop calling this man by a term of subjugation invented by white people for African people. And I also want to bring up that this whole thing about, how there's this constant depiction of him that he was just, quiet, non-threatening, affable, black male persona. Now, we all have various aspects of our personality, but I've read and I've read and I've read, and I'm finding that is the aspects of his personality that just keep staying on repeat. Like, he never got mad. He was a very strong man. Like, he never knocked no one out. He never, did anything, right? And I just have to wonder if that's not somehow tied to a highly preferred depiction of black masculinity, also emanating from slavery, from enslavement. That of the African man who, of course, keeps himself very calm, has a very flat effect almost. Why? All for the comfortability of white people. And actually doing any different, could result in death. So I wonder if it's just somehow tied to that if they weren't adapting his personality or just seeing what they want to see, perhaps he, coming out of that environment, wasn't adapting his own personality. But you see, what they didn't erase was, or what they did erase was the violence and the harassment they leveled at him. So it's very possible that they erased other parts of his personality, but they didn't erase that. Okay, so I want to point that out. They had John Ware to hold up as their singular representation of inclusion, and they didn't have to examine the systemic or personal racism, like literally, until 1970. All right, let's go on to the next one. So here we have a woman, and she represents some like the domestic or entrepreneurs that came, and this is in 1877. And also, according to the research of Black historian and documentarian Cheryl Fogle, Mary was enslaved for the first 30 years of her life. So she had that in common with John. And she met this Colonel McLeod and his wife on a riverboat that were traveling up the Missouri River into Montana. And Cheryl explains that she told the folks to call me Auntie Annie. And it was a way to self-label during a time when degrading epithets were regularly assigned to Africans in America by white supremacists. So if she didn't give them a name, they were surely going to come up with one. And it probably wouldn't be good. She struck a deal to care for the McLeod's children, and then she soon branched out into owning a boarding house with a restaurant and a laundry service, which had a lot of customers, apparently in this little growing frontier town, colonial town. That dignified colored, quote unquote, was what one customer referred to her as. And, I guess she was doing quite well financially. Also on record is the time in 1884 where she was physically assaulted by some crazy white woman, Mrs. Brulette. Okay, so Mrs. Brulette, got all crazy with herself and came and physically assaulted. She laid hands on Annie Saunders. Now, there is no mention of any consequences for Mrs. Brulette. And given how Black people doing well and carrying themselves with dignity, as was accounted, it's often a trigger for white supremacy. It's a trigger. So it's no surprise to me that Annie Saunders was attacked, or nor do I believe that that was the only act of violence she was subjected to. Okay, that was just one little thing on record. See, that's just not how it works, especially if you're Black and you have something to show for yourself. The support of other white townsfolk is also nothing to lapse into warm, fuzzy feelings about, because they said, oh, they just loved her and she was so great. But I look at it a little bit differently. Because in white supremacist cultures, people will temper their racism if, number one, you have a service or skill they need. Number two, your group is low in number and you present no collective challenge to their acquisition of resources. And she was but a single woman. And number three, they know you as a person. This evokes another phenomenon within white supremacy called, quote unquote, the Negro I know. The Negro I know, where a singular person may experience a degree of goodwill or acceptance based on familiarity. But that goodwill is not extended to the racial group. In fact, racism towards the racial group remain unchanged. Auntie Annie Saunders' success and treatment is not an indication of progress or milder Canadian views when we understand it like this. It must be contextualized by the nuances that affords a single Black person, occasionally a more positive outcome than her presence and then had her presence and acumen be multiplied within a larger collective of Black folk at the same place and time. Then, and believe me on this, the refrain changes from the Negro I know into they're taking over. The response to that is evidenced by the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, the Black Wall Street massacre of 1921, and even the Shelburne race riots in Nova Scotia in 1784, to only name a few. And those are all instances where white terrorist mobs attacked and nearly wiped out up and coming Black towns. All right, next slide. So 1905 to 1915, mass Black immigration. So in 1905, the Dominion of Canada, it officially declared what was the Northwest Territories to be the province of Alberta, and they drew new borders. They drew the borders we have today. And the Indigenous nations had been weakened through a program of land steals, buffalo decimation, that was their main food source. Remember, they moved into cattle and they protected those cattle. You try to go near those cattle, they blow your head off. And unethical treaties which guaranteed food in times of famine and livelihood in the thriving agrarian settler state, except they were denied. They were denied. When the Indigenous nations tried to enact the treaties, they were met with a resounding no. So then the reserve system was enforced to essentially quarantine the survivors of European diseases, slaughter, and starvation. So the question, how to fill the prairies with people lest the Indigenous nations miraculously recoup and challenge a take-back. That was their greatest fear. And I'm taking that from this book right here, Clearing the Plains by James Dashak. So the Dominionist government began to devise plans to get people into the new province quickly. Unlike other provinces, Alberta saw a huge influx in American immigrants. The preference was originally English or Ontarians, English speaking Ontarians. That's who they really wanted. But Americans, in seeking of cheap land, they greatly outnumbered any migrants from Eastern Canada or England itself. So the government quickly canvassed non English Europeans since the American flood was not stopping. There was no stopping these people. Germans, Slavs, Ukrainians, and Welsh and others answered the call. Okay, next slide. And this is how they advertise. They put out posters like this. They send agents down into the states, and you see this idyllic poster, the last best west, pardon me, homes for millions. So indicating we want all kinds of y'all people to come. And then you can do your thing, ranching, dairying, grain raising. It's just going to be great and it's be beautiful. All right, next. Western Canada, the new El Dorado, homes for everybody. We want everybody to come. Easy to reach, nothing to fear. Now why do you think they would say nothing to fear? Protected by the government. So you can just come here and do your thing, and it doesn't matter how illegally we got this land. Nobody's going to challenge you for it. That's the message. This is your opportunity. Why not embrace it? All right, next slide. Canada, the right land for the right man. Now, what does that man look like? Who they want? That's a white man. So what it should say, the right land for the white man. And it does say that, because then he's standing right there. So the message is clear. And you can get there by Canadian National Railways. So there's the right man right there. So, however, the USA comprised 30% of Alberta's immigrants between 1900 and 1920, leading an Alberta member of parliament to declare in parliament that his province might be regarded as a typical American state. Quote from a book by Howard Palmer, Patterns of Prejudice. Also, American homesteaders eagerly recruited by officialdom, and you see all of these posters are very official. They had all the backing of the government. They struck roots, enjoyed high status, and their ideas germinated and blossomed in these foundational years. Americans constituted a charter immigrant group in Alberta, although other groups, Ontarians, Brits, continental Europeans, contribute to molding provincial politics. Americans and their ideas proved exceptionally influential. It's from Nelson Wiseman out of Concordia University. So what are these ideas that proved exceptionally influential? Well, as for their ideological outlooks, like their counterparts in the United States, they often held strong right-wing views. Peter C. Newman, The Canadian Establishment. These right-wing views included individualism, self-government, white supremacy, and notions of equality that applied only to themselves. So what's being left out of this whole immigration narrative is that over 1,000 African Americans also responded to those advertisements they sent out in the States and came to settle this brand new province too. However, they were not the right man for the right land. Next, please. So Oklahoma was a free territory when Black folk moved to it from the states that were built upon our enslavement. But when it became a state in 1907, the rush to dominate land and resources was on. Jim Crow law was passed instantly, and it just trampled our rights, just took our rights right out. We lost the right to vote, Segregation was heavily imposed. My people sold their farms and homes and chartered trains to come to Alberta to escape the pattern of white supremacists, whether organized as KKK or not, because they had all kinds of little ways they organized themselves, who threatened, attacked, and killed Blacks who had any signs of prosperity. Notice what I said. We sold farms, homes, and chartered trains. Mobility requires money. That meant we owned land. We owned homes. We had money to pay for all the train cars, to transport all the livestock and farm implements and people and everybody. Okay? So imagine the bull's eye that was on my people for daring to prosper. An estimated 30 Black Oklahomans were lynched, which was a murder, a type of murder by mobs of white supremacists between 1907 and 1930, including some especially sadistic killings I'm not even going to mention here because it's too graphic. And so once again, we were forced to decide how we were going to preserve our lives. So those posters came out, and as you see in this picture, we came. So we came here, next slide. We came here to minus 45 degrees and also petitions. What? What do you mean? We just got here. This is supposed to be the land of milk and honey. Oh, no. But there was petitions to ban us from Canada. Several, including the Board of Trade and a popular white supremacist women's group, courtesy of British immigrants, interestingly. It was called the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire. Okay, the Imperial Orders, the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire. Okay, get down. And they're a Canadian charity that has active membership to this day. So they got all them petitions together, and then it was passed by Edmonton City Council that they didn't want Black immigration. Next slide. And this is like an actual image of an order in council, because they didn't stop there. Then it went up. They kind of, flew it up the flagpole. Okay. So this is signed by Sir Wilfrid Laurier. It didn't receive final assent, but that actually didn't matter. And I'll explain why in a second. For a period of 1 year from and after the date hereof of any immigrants belonging to the Negro race, which race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada. That's coming from the Prime Minister of Canada. Next slide. It's a pretty warm reception.
Hey Junetta, one thing I'd just like to point out is a lot of the city councilors and the important people in Edmonton at the time currently have neighborhoods and landmarks named after them. So these were the people in charge, and we decided that they did such good work that we named things after them. Like, for example, the entire neighborhood of Oliver, named after Frank Oliver.
You're right, Genna. I mean, their names, their legacy is immortalized all over the place. Oliver's just one, but absolutely, we live not just with the systems that, the vast majority of us don't know they created to run as they do. It's all by design. But yeah, just even with the naming, like we're just saturated in this, and American anti-Black racial violence and the KKK. So this is what we see here, because that also came, they started organizing themselves. It didn't take but a minute. They boasted a roster of 300,000 in Alberta and Saskatchewan. That might be exaggerated, but in terms of who prescribed to their views, I mean, that part is not exaggerated, since many Americans were in positions of leadership here in Alberta. That Klan sentiment infected Alberta society and its institutions. Okay? And that's really important to acknowledge. Remember, I had said earlier that Americans enjoyed very high status here. They were like the man with the plan and in charge of pretty much anything that was going on in this province. And the further south in the province you went, the more they ran things. And, They were just anti-Black and racist to the core. So cross burnings were a regular event across Alberta, um, you know, including Edmonton. I know my people, they definitely told me all about the cross burnings and stuff like that. They would happen in rural Alberta all the time. It was, just something that was not even shocking. And the KKK, they even burned a huge one on Connors Hill to celebrate Dan Knott's election as mayor. Now, Dan Knott, he was a huge Klan supporter behind scenes. But again, many were. Look at all the people filling this room. Look at them. That room is packed. There's probably people waiting outside, wrapped around the block. Okay? They had so many supporters, it wasn't even funny. That's why they call themselves the Invisible Empire, because they everywhere. Next slide. So, but we were farming. Some of us were in the cities, but the majority of us, like we were on our settlements farming. We were just like, oh my God, okay, well, no one else can come, so let's just do what we can since we're here. And we had Wildwood. That's where my people are from. Breton, Campsie, the Eldon district in Saskatchewan. That's where my husband's people are from. And then you have Mr. J.D. Edwards in Amber Valley. My husband's people also from there. All right, next slide. Now, the old timers, they had a very utopian report of settlement life. Like, oh, it was hard work, but free of racism. Everybody had fun with their neighbors. Everyone got along. And this utopian view is something I've raised recently with a number of elders, particularly those who are sharp and politically aware. And now they're looking back and they're actually telling me something else, the ones who are politically aware. I have been told that there's actually a lot of denial about the attitudes of their white neighbors, that this common narrative that just keeps rolling out on repeat, that everyone was so nice and we had fun. No, they're in denial. And in fact, microaggressions, they happen all the time. And what are microaggressions? They are those insults, slights, invalidations delivered to people who are not members of the overculture. That's what a microaggression is. So how is this okay and made things a racism-free paradise? And it wasn't until I went through some old letters to folks back home written by my husband's uncle, Mr. Bobby Jamerson, that it became more clear that his exaltations of Alberta told me that he defined utopia as the absence of lynchings. That's what those letters told me. All the other racist problems, they didn't even register as long as there were no mob lynchings. And it made me see that, no one had ever really bothered to ask the old folks how they defined racism. So that's kind of interesting. Now, this is the Amber Valley baseball team here. Okay, and they were very good. And in fact, all the Black baseball teams were very good. This was not the only one. There was others. And they had better skill, strength, coordination, mental acuity. Baseball can be kind of a strategic game. But they had to make it into a joke. They fashioned themselves into like the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball. They put on a show, they'd have some fun, just keep it light, But what would have happened to Utopia if they had played according to their ability? What would have happened if these Black men had played according to their ability?
Oh, likely nothing good. Probably other baseball teams or just other groups in general would have come down and say, hey, you can't play like that. You can't play better than us because you are Black, and that's not okay.
Yeah, it would have just opened up a whole can of trouble. Utopia would have just turned into the pit of hell. And, they actually came to compete and defeat, played according to their ability. I can guarantee you that white fear would have gone into overdrive, and all their racist aggression that white supremacy could throw at these men and their families would be hurled at their heads. So to keep the peace, they were comedic. That's what I think because this was a white supremacy society, and I know how this works. Let's go into the next one. You had already foreshadowed this, Skinner. There's Frank Oliver. There his ass is. So he was an MP, Minister of the Interior, and he was a virulent racist and land thief who was the principal architect of modern Western Canada. And when he wasn't stealing indigenous land, he was devising informal ways to keep my people out of Alberta, so to avoid an actual change to the Immigration Act. So they actually changed the Immigration Act to officially say, we don't allow Black people. That was going to look very bad internationally. So he came up with all these other ways, right? He came up with all these informal ways. He bribed doctors to stop us at the border by subjecting us to unbelievable examinations. Yup, medical racism. He leaned on Border Patrol agents to deny our documents, charge higher entry fees, or just lose paperwork. He hired 2 agent provocateurs, 2 Black men, one a doctor, the other a preacher, to go to all these Black towns in Oklahoma and spread lies and information about Alberta. The doctor, his name was G.W. Miller. G.W. Miller. Remember that fool's name. He was from Chicago. And he reported daily back to old Frank Oliver. He surveilled Black families. He recorded their assets. He tracked their movements. He got local preachers and Black leaders on board to also spread the lies that nothing grew. It was inhospitable. You would die. And those same Black preachers and leaders also gave him more access, more continued access to the Black communities in Oklahoma. They opened the door wide for G.W. Miller. He gained access to their pulpits. He gave speeches. He gave access to the Black press. This man was a walking, talking surveillance propaganda machine. Frank Oliver paid him. He worked for Frank Oliver. Next slide. So what happened next? And I am mindful of time. So the combined effect of the Klan, the petitions, the city council motion, that Wilfrid Laurier's order in council, the agent provocateurs, all but killed African American immigration to the prairies. The 1,500 of us who came, like we were it. You know. In fact, we remained the only Black people or the only Black community on the prairies until, slowly a few people from the Caribbean started to trickle in the 60s. And then we more saw a group come in the 80s. And so our story is actually unlike any other immigration story in Western Canada. Every other group that came enjoyed successive waves from their home country. But we had one wave, which meant for nearly 80 years, there was no new thought, no new blood, no cultural reinforcement. There was nobody else coming from our culture of origin. And then when we began to leave the settlements for work and education in the 40s to 70s, we were met with yet another massive wave of racism in the cities, fueled by, again, institutions that were created for and by white supremacy. So what happened? What happened, after we encountered all this stuff in the cities? Did we get over? Did we conquer all? Exactly. Actually, it's the opposite. I hate to say this, but it was really the official beginning to our end. And contrary to reports that my people are surviving and thriving, as a collective, we are actually ceasing to exist. The generation before me, being the umpteenth to live in North America since our forced removal from Africa, the way I see it is that they just kind of gave up. There's of course some outstanding individuals, but as a collective, they just kind of gave up. Um, they chose to assimilate, which is taking on the practices and beliefs of the dominant culture with the understanding that it is better. And I would dare say the false understanding that it is better. All right, next slide. So the majority wanted to remove themselves of the burden of blackness. And, I hate to say it, but like that's what they did. So, when racism gets into you and is now on the inside, you now operate out of something called the internalized racism response. And that's when people of color develop beliefs and behavior that collude with or support the institution of racism. Yeah. There are real and perceived rewards for internalizing racism, just as there are real and perceived punishments for not internalizing racism. That's from Donna K. Bivens. And it ushered in the complete breakdown of my cultural community to the extent that today we do not meet one criteria of a distinct ethnic group. So, how the internalized racism shows up is by folks taking action to remove cultural markers. Those are discernible things that create a sense of belonging and identity, particularly to an ethnic or cultural group. Because they crave belonging to the dominant group, they intentionally shed their cultural markers. And it got to the point where the ones who had shed their cultural markers looked down on those who were late to do so. And I could preach a whole sermon about that because it damn well happened. So, what were the cultural markers that they rid themselves of when they faced just that intense racism in the cities? It was our spiritual practices, which were traditionally quite, synthesized African American traditions, our musical expressions and artistic expressions, our culinary arts, our accent, of course, our dress and adornment, our style, our flair, our affiliation with other Black people, and definitely our type of humor and the expression of it. And our worldview. They adopted the more of the white supremacist worldview. Next one. So how do we define progress? Like, what the heck is progress even? So how do institutions here in Alberta, based on a foundation of white supremacy, progress to be safe for Black people? And in some ways, we as Black people, we can define progress for ourselves. So how do we progress? Well, we progress in a white supremacist society by the degree to which we accept ourselves, not how much white folks accept us. Flip it. The measure by which we have loving, healthy unions and relationships with one another. The development of our own societies and organizations explicitly focused on teaching our young people the best of our culture and beliefs. Notice I said the best of. There needs to be some vetting because everything, just because it's culture, it don't mean it's all good. So, mine for gold and keep it. The recognition and reclamation of our collectivist practices rather than the myth of individualization. I can absolutely prove that the society we're in is not one of individualism. It is a collectivist society. White society is collectivist. They work together in ways we don't understand. And understanding culture as a protective factor rather than a liability. So using my people as a sociological case study, we can see that doing the opposite of this puts a group in a state of contraction, not expansion. Group progress particularly by dominant cultural standards, is thereby not achieved. So, funny about that, what we set out to do, we actually achieved the exact opposite. How do institutions progress? And I'm coming to an end here. So, you saw earlier in my presentation, the theme of being the first was prevalent. I talked about the first Black cowboy, the first Black woman that was here, the first fur traders, first. And in fact, you'll notice that during Black History Month, and again, tell me if you've noticed this, that a lot of what you see is a collection of the first fill in the blank type of stories. Have you seen that?
Yeah, fairly often I have.
Yeah. So being the first carries a lot of weight in white supremacist ideology because think about it. If you look at social studies and all this kind of stuff and just going to school, these white curriculums, a lot of what you study is the first, from the first man on the moon, for the first to explore here and there. It's the first, right? That's something that's very important to them. So of course it's going to be imposed upon our treatment of history. Institutions will allow a Black person to be the first fill in the blank to join their ranks. That person may even be promoted. But the history here, given Alberta's society, is founded on white supremacy, tells us two things. Number one, that the first will often be the last for a long time. Meaning, okay, you might be the first one they hire, but you're going to be the only one they hire for a really long time. And the first was also carefully chosen for their commitment to assimilation and their demonstration of internalized racism response. They will be scrutinized for their assimilated qualities. Excuse me. Before being hired. Sorry. Sorry about that. So what we have normalized here is tokenism, which is actually a superficial effort to be inclusive, recruiting racialized or marginalized folks to protect the organization's appearance or reputation. The real power, influence, and respect, however, is reserved for white people. Institutions do not progress by having a few tokens up in there or on their branding, on their advertisements. Institutions do progress by hiring and empowering anti-racist leadership that is supported to make the changes required. Now, in Alberta, this is highly performative. The token anti-racist committees and hires are the latest trend. But I'm going to tell you, they have no power. Excuse me. Forgive me. Excuse me, everyone. They don't have any power. And when they try to fulfill what they were brought in to do, they are undermined and ignored. They're gaslit. They're blocked. Their recommendations are scrapped, shelved, or watered down till they're unrecognizable. Then they're fired, and new tokens are brought in for the same mistreatment. They use unofficial tactics, just like Frank Oliver, to maintain the white supremacist status quo. Now, there are always two sets of rules. There's what's on paper. Oh, it's our policy. Yeah. But then there's the unofficial tactics with all the complicitness in the world to carry them out. So when racism is disclosed, it is not progress to do nothing like what happened when Annie Saunders was attacked. And we know what would have happened to her if she would have knocked that woman in the next week. She should have defended herself, right? She had every right to defend herself. But if she would have, we know that the outcome would have been really different for Annie. So worse, it's flipped on the victim. And then when we see this in institutions, they're pushed out of the organization so overt racism can continue to flourish. And like that's what's been happening in Calgary and the Edmonton fire departments. There's just been article after article, headlines all over the place, and many other places. It's not progress, it's toxic self protectionism. Now, it is progress to fire racists. But for that, we must define racism as actual racism and not, oh, she was just having a bad day. You know, we want to uphold respectful workplace policy. And I hear all the time how changing an organization's culture is so hard. Well, you know what? It's not. It's not. Institutions know how to get rid of anybody they don't want. Anybody. They have all the unofficial processes they need. So just use them to get rid of the racist staff in leadership, racist board members. You know how to do it. You can get rid of people. What's been missing is the lack of will to do so because, quite frankly, leadership is resistant and comfortable with the status quo that allows for racism. And there's no other explanation. This stuff isn't hard. Institutions can overhaul how they attract talent, who they attract, and how they are retained, which, again, it's not rocket science, is by fair, respectful treatment. They can overhaul their policies and instill compliance measures so they are actually followed and not just words on paper. They can hire people of color for their intelligence, skill, and acumen, and allow those traits to show up every day and not be met with punitive measures because somebody feels insecure. They will not have to shroud their skill in humor, shrink down, minimize their talent, like the Amber Valley baseball team. So white people don't attack. They can purge from their ranks those who provide shoddy service or instruction to Black clientele, like those who would refuse service to John Ware. And definitely fire those who make false accusations and weaponize authority, like the people who would call the cops on him for no reason. Get rid of their ass. These are the ways that we can begin to bring true equity, not the twisted version of equality that Americans brought and everyone else reinforced. It's time to get serious about progress, not as a warm feeling, but as an identifiable, measurable application and put an end to the racism on repeat that has been dogging our province since its inception. Thank you. I am Junetta Jamerson.
Thank you, Junetta. That was fantastic. I definitely have a lot or had a lot to think about while you were talking. And by the comments, I see that a lot of people did as well. Um, we do have one audience question. And if I'm interpreting this correctly, the question is why it took not a lot of time for groups like the Ku Klux Klan to organize back in the 30s. Like, why were so many people on board with it within such a short time?
Sorry, Gina, you were just breaking up. Why it took what groups to organize? So it took what
Uh,
groups so long?
like white supremacist groups.
Why it took them so long to organize?
So short of a time.
Why it took them so short. Well, I explained that part because the vast majority of immigrants were Americans and they quickly ascended to positions of power within the developing settler state. So they brought their ideology with them, they brought their practices with them. And so they didn't have to learn it from the ground up. They just simply got busy doing what they had already done back in the states that they had come from. I mean, this is just what they did. It was add water and stir.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So true. One of the things that I reflected on as you were talking was the concept of the model minority. So, how you were talking about John Ware and the way in which, like, white supremacist or white history has taken the traits of John Ware that they deem acceptable, um, and given them to him as if like this was the only depiction of John Ware that there was, and this is the only thing that you should know about him. And it reminds me that, like, in particular, European and North American history, how white supremacy has worked its way into writing our history, writing our stories, and giving us just a very one-sided view of marginalized groups, of black important black figures and other people in other communities as well, and how we need to take the time and actually do the work and dig into whether it's like community history, community historians, the historian you mentioned, Cheryl Fago, and actually see who these people were in real life.
That's why she came up with her latest movie, reimagining John Ware, because she knows as a Black woman from this culture, she's a hereditary member too, she knows that there was more to him than she was reading. So she's like, I'm going to dig in and let me find out who this man really was, not this flat character that kept appearing over and over, carefully crafted for the comfortability of white people, the convenience of white people. She knew that wasn't the truth. So that's exactly what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think we are coming up to the end of our time here, and thank you all so much for coming out. Um, we do have three other events this month. If you are interested in attending them, they are available. The information is available on the NorQuest website. Our next one is next Friday, February 19th. We are hosting an all alumni panel, an all NorQuest alumni panel on anti-Black racism. So again, it's from 11 a.m. to noon. The link will be available on the NorQuest events page. And we are featuring three alumni, one from the Practical Nurse Program and one or two from social work. So you can hear them talk about their experiences with anti-Black racism within their time here at NorQuest. So again, thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of the day. Stay warm. Stay inside if you can. Junetta, did you have anything else that you wanted to add here?
No, thank you for having me. I hope that I got some folks' wheels turning. And, when it comes to, taking on racism, it feels like a monstrous task. How will it ever change? You know what? It's so easy. Use the way that the system has already been working, except now to benefit us. And for that, like, I'm sorry, there's going to some people have to go, right? You're just going to have to get new people in there who can use what's there for the benefit of people like you and me.
Mm-hmm, for sure. All right. Take care, everybody.